Welcome to the second installment of my accidental new series, which I guess we should call My American Identity Crisis. Now, the first installment was My Italian American Identity Crisis, DNA versus culture versus stereotypes. Here's the sequel. We're going to talk about My Mexican American Identity Crisis. And the reason I'm making this the second installment, because my mother, being half Italian, which as we've learned through her DNA test, Sephardic, Jewish, and Middle Eastern, not actually Italian. She's only 2% Italian through the DNA test. Well, the other half, Mexican, okay? So I want to explore that a little bit more because definitely being Mexican is part of my American identity. And it is a crisis because depending on where you are watching this video from, you already may think this video is ridiculous. Especially if you're in Europe, you're probably already confused on why am I even identifying as Mexican when even my grandmother was born in America. It was my great-grandparents who moved from Mexico a long time ago. Okay, let's look at my heritage DNA test real quick. So as far as the Mexican side of me, 21.6% of me shows up as Central American. You know, Mayan, Aztec, whatever that was going on, that part of me. In addition to that 21.6%, we've also got 31.8% Iberian. Spanish, we would assume largely, more so than the Portuguese side. So when you add 21 and 31 alone, right there, over 50% of my DNA, ultimately, arguably, it's tracing back to the Mexican side. Now we could say that, because we know that my dad's like half, 2% Iberian, and really not much came from him. And we could say that, well, maybe my grandfather, who was the Italian, maybe he had some Iberian in there because he was part Sephardic Jewish. Okay, but still overall, just looking at this on paper, I am a pretty Mexican guy in regards to what we see here. Because over 20% of me is Central American and over 30% of me is ultimately Spanish. Even though I might have got a few drops from the other couple of sides. But it's interesting. Why is this an identity crisis? For so many reasons, and I'm sure I've covered most of them before, but let's do this all in one video. Let's talk about why it's such an identity crisis for me as someone who has Mexican heritage. So for one thing, there's the realization that there's no Spanish spoken. I can't speak any Spanish other than hola, you know, that kind of, I can read French pretty well. I studied French a lot in high school and college. Spanish, I didn't. And I've mentioned before, my Mexican grandma, who I was very close to, grew up around, she didn't speak any Spanish. I never heard her say one word of Spanish because when she was a little girl, her parents wouldn't allow her to speak Spanish. They wanted her to only speak English so she could move up in the world. Imagine too, my Mexican great-grandparents came here from southern Mexico not speaking English, and they made a life for themselves in Buffalo, New York. That's amazing. And so, but they wanted to make sure that she had quite a jump up in her life, and they didn't allow her to speak Spanish. Therefore, my mother didn't speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish. There's no Spanish spoken. So ultimately, well then what really about me is Mexican American? Other than the fact of my DNA and that my grandmother's maiden name was Dolores Mendez, what ultimately is Mexican about me? You know, it's funny because I love every meal I eat, I have to have hot sauce on. And I used to think, oh yeah, well, I'm part Mexican. It makes sense. Everything has to have extreme hot sauce on it. Everything. Which is why, one of the reasons I like Thailand so much, those 2 summers I spent there. Because they're the same way over there. Everything's got the chili pepper sauce in it. But really, no one on the Mexican side ever ate spicy food in front of me. It was my dad, who's 99% Northwestern European, that ate spicy food, and I adopted that, and it's a big part of me. Other than maybe how I look, when people try to guess my ethnicity, they say, well, you look like you're Spanish. But see, even that goes into the identity crisis, because this is coming from an American standpoint, where so many Americans confuse Spanish and Mexican, and they just kind of make it the same thing. So they'll say you look Spanish, but really a lot of the times they mean Mexican or Puerto Rican or Cuban. They mean something like that. They're not really meaning from Spain. That's not what they mean. Because as they continue to talk, I can tell that's where the conversation's going. So it's an identity crisis in that I'm Mexican American to a certain extent, yet people will generically label me as Spanish. That's what people do. And, well, over 30% of me is Iberian DNA. So that, I think, leads to a lot of the Mexican part of my identity crisis. There's no Spanish spoken. Not even my grandma spoke Spanish. She was born here. But yet, especially growing up in the South, my sister and I, and my mom, you could tell we weren't the same as everybody else, and that was always implied. They always knew my mom was something else and that we were person of the two, so questions would come up. It's not like I went around, hey everybody, I'm a quarter Mexican, do-do-do-do-do. And again, remember, no one in my entire life, in real life, has ever corrected me when I say I'm a quarter Mexican. That is part of the American thing too. And I think a lot of my European viewers, it's like they get bothered by that. They get bothered when I say things like a quarter Mexican. Because in American culture, you can say it and it's fine. But outside of that, you can't. So there's certain things too that kind of add to that identity crisis as someone who is a Mexican American, which I am to a certain degree, is that even to talk about it sounds clumsy and confusing. So my grandma was Mexican. Well, actually, she was American. Her parents were Mexican. So that really just makes me an American who has Mexican heritage. Am I really Mexican American? This is the identity crisis on the Mexican side. What really about me is Mexican other than my DNA? Because even my Mexican grandma, she passed away about 1.5 years ago. But about a year before she did, and she was in her late 70s, her older brother came down from New York to visit her, and it had been years. So I saw them together. My grandma was able to stand up. She was at her nursing home, and her brother walked in. And I just kind of watched. I was there holding one of my kids, and I was just watching them. And you could tell they were totally siblings. You could tell you could see it. And as I was watching these people that were in the late 70s, early 80s, these Mexican Americans, I thought, this is what was mine. I thought, they don't even seem Mexican. They just seem like they're people from New York. They seem like they're people who were born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and they just happen to be of Mexican descent. So I said something about that, because they never once spoke Spanish or referred to anything Mexican or anything like that. They just talked like they were regular Americans with an accent from Buffalo, New York. And I said something to the effect of, I said, now, did the two of you see yourself as Mexican? And they seemed confused, and by the question, just kind of laughed, and they're like, well, I guess we are. I guess we're just American. So I mean, that's even they weren't even embracing it. They weren't ashamed or embracing the fact that they were Mexican Americans. So it's interesting too, on all the surveys we have to do in America, we have to check our heritage, and I've said this before, it'll say white, and then a separate thing, Hispanic, but not white. And that's really confusing. So yeah, to be an American of Mexican descent, there's a little bit of an identity crisis. Can anybody out there watching this relate to me? Or do you just want to say that I'm a moron? Because I hear that a lot. But can anyone relate? Comments, I'd love to hear about it.